Welcome to the world of sci-fi stories, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the channel. Enjoy the listening. A lone human entered the War Council, holding the Supreme Overlord's severed head. Grand Admiral Vex Thor drummed his three-fingered hand against the obsidian table. The War Council of the Seven Galaxies had been droning on for nearly 6 orbital cycles, and still no consensus had been reached. Typical bureaucratic nonsense. The Supreme Overlord would be displeased perhaps if we deployed the neutron eradicators to the Terran colony, suggested Commander Quilnar, his purple membrane fluttering with excitement at the prospect of more destruction, and waste our most valuable weapons on those primitive mammals. Hey, General Brathkar's booming laugh echoed through the chamber. His massive scaled body shifted, causing his ceremonial armor to clank loudly. The humans will be crushed by conventional means. They're barely space-capable. Vex Thor sighed heavily through his respiratory slits. The arrogance in this room was suffocating, almost as bad as the methane atmosphere they adjusted for the comfort of the Jovian delegates. The humans had proven far more resilient than anyone anticipated, but saying so would be politically unwise. The Supreme Overlord expects results. Vex Thor reminded them, his voice deliberately calm. 3 of our forward bases have gone dark in the past lunar cycle. The human resistance is a thunderous boom interrupted his carefully measured words as the 20-feet reinforced titanium doors to the War Council chamber blew inward. Alarm screen security drones activated, their weapon systems humming to life, and there, standing amid the smoke and debris, was a single human female. Meeting adjourned, she announced, her voice eerily calm. Breach. We have a breach, shrieked Admiral Zolvan, his tendrils coiling in distress. Guards. The human smiled, a terrifying expression that displayed far too many teeth. She stepped forward into the light, and collective gasps filled the chamber. In her right hand, clutched by its TIAO crest, was the unmistakable head of Supreme Overlord Krazak himself. The tyrant's 7 eyes were frozen open in what appeared to be was that fear. Impossible. What is the meaning of this sacrilege? Demanded High Chancellor Pex Lore, rising to his full 12-t height. By luminescent markings flashing danger patterns across his exoskeleton, the human casually tossed the severed head onto the center of the war table. It landed with a wet thunk ping slightly before coming to rest, facing Vex Thor, who found himself unable to look away from his former master's lifeless gaze. Thought I'd save you all some time, the human said, wiping her bloodied hand on her combat suit. Consider this my application for his job. A horrified silence descended upon the chamber. None of the 53 representatives of the Galactic Hegemony moved. Even the security drone seemed frozen in place. You killed Krazak alone, stuttered Commander Quilnar, his voice raised several octaves in disbelief. Nah, I had helped, the human replied with a shrug. My playlist kept me motivated, nothing like classic rock, while you're dismantling an empire. Am I right? Grand Admiral Vex Thor's 4 hearts skipped several beats. The Supreme Overlord dead at the hands of a single human. It was incomprehensible, impossible, and yet there was the evidence leaking various fluid onto their strategic star maps. This council is now under new management, the human announced, pulling up the only empty chair, Krazak's ceremonial throne, and sitting down with her boots propped up on the table mere inches from the severed head. So who wants to discuss terms of surrender first? The Galactic Hegemony had dominated the known universe for over 12,000 cycles. They had encountered hundreds of species, assimilated thousands of worlds, and established an unquestionable rule across 7 major galaxies. Their technological superiority was absolute, or so they thought. History would later mark the discovery of Earth as their greatest tactical blunder, a Class 3 world with bipedal primates barely worth a footnote. The scout commander had reported 12 years ago. The humans didn't even register as a threat on the Hegemon's 11-point civilization scale. No faster than light travel, no unified planetary government, no significant telepathic abilities, just another primitive species to be cataloged, exploited, and eventually subjugated when resources became necessary. Grand Admiral Vex Thor remembered approving the soft infiltration protocol standard procedure. Observed the primitives assess resources Prepare for eventual harvesting. The Overlord had barely glanced at the report before stamping it with his approval seal. No one expected the humans to notice they detected our cloak. Observation posts within 3 months, muttered General Brathart, his scales flushing a humiliated orange as he recalled the events. Some teenager with a modified radio telescope in her backyard. Of all things, once aware of extraterrestrial observation, the humans reacted in a manner the human behavioral specialists had never predicted. Instead of panic, religious upheaval, or societal collapse, the typical responses of pre-full species, they unified practically overnight. And they were angry. Remember the first diplomatic vessel we sent? Commander Quiller asked, his membrane deflating slightly. They blew it out of orbit without even responding to communications. What followed was a rapid, almost impossible acceleration of human technological development. Within 2 years, they had reverse-engineered salvage components from the HEM's observation posts. Within 4, they had crude but functional faster-than-light capabilities. By year 6, they'd launched their first successful counterstrike against a HEMI outpost. We should have hit them with the planet crackers. Immediately, General Brathkar insisted, not for the first time, decisive action. The Supreme Overlord believed that would be wasteful. Admiral Zolvan countered, his tendrils waving dismissively. Earth was classified as resource or potential breeding world for the Jovian colonies. What none of them understood, what the entire hegemony failed to grasp, was the adaptability of humanity. While the Galactic Hegemony had evolved through methodical conquest over millennia, humans evolved through constant brutal competition with themselves. Their short lifespans meant they thought quickly, acted decisively, and innovated constantly. Most dangerously, they had thousands of years of recorded warfare against their own kind to draw upon. Did you know, Vex Thor said quietly, that their combat simulations, they call them video games, us prepared their younger generations for three-dimensional tactical thinking from an early age. The war, when it officially began, was supposed to be brief, a simple matter of showing force, accepting surrender, and implementing standard assimilation protocols. Instead, it became a hemorrhaging wound in the HEM's resources. The humans didn't fight conventionally. They used guerrilla tactics. They sacrificed themselves in suicide missions that achieved strategic objectives. They even weaponized their own cultural transmissions, deploying what they called memes as psychological warfare. The worst was their unpredictability. High Chancellor Pex Lore admitted, his exoskeleton clicking nervously. Remember the Proxima Center offensive? We had them outnumbered 20-1. Then they, what was that maneuver called? The Crazy Ivan. Vex Thor supplied an ancient submarine tactic repurposed for space warfare. We lost 16 capital ships 8 years into the conflict. The Supreme Overlord Krazak had taken personal command of the human suppression forces. His brutality was legendary, his tactical brilliance unquestioned. Under his direction, the hegemony finally began to gain ground. 3 human colonies fell. Earth itself was blockaded. Victory seemed assured until apparently today the War Council members stared at the human female, trying to comprehend how their perfect system had failed so catastrophic. How could a species that had been jumping between stars for less than a decade have produced a warrior capable of this? You still don't get it, to you, the human said, noticing their confused expressions. You guys play chess. We play Calvin ball. Rules are for suckers. Supreme Overlord Krazak hadn't always been a tyrant. That was the truly terrifying part before his rise to power. He had been Ambassador CAC of the Nick Stallion Confederation, a diplomatic prodigy known for skillfully negotiating peace treaties between warring species. His 7 eyes gave him the ability to observe multiple opponents simultaneously, a biological advantage that, combined with his exceptional intellect, made him unparalleled in galactic politics. I served under him during the Andromeda Accords. Admiral Zuvan reminisced, staring at the severed head that had once housed such a brilliant mind. He prevented a war between the crystal and hive mind and the gaseous collectives with nothing but words. 3 days of talking, no weapons drawn. Kak's ascension to Supreme Overlord had been celebrated across the hegemony after centuries of stagnation under previous administrations. Here finally was a leader who understood the delicate balance of power and diplomacy required to govern such a vast interstellar empire. Then came the human problem. The first failure changed him. General Brethar commended, his voice uncharacteristically solemn. When the humans destroyed our diplomatic vessel without warning, it was the first time. One of his carefully crafted approaches had been completely rejected. The council members shifted. Uncomfortably, none of them had been present when KAC received the news of that first devastating loss, but the recordings had become infamous throughout the hegemony. The Supreme Overlord had been completely still for 6 full minutes. Then, without a word, he had methodically executed the 3 messengers who delivered the report, not in anger, which would have been understandable, but with surgical precision, as if conducting a necessary experiment. I wondered sometimes, Vex Thor admitted, if that was when he began to see all of us as mere tools, as the war with humanity intensified. CAC's transformation accelerated. Planets that failed to meet resource quotas for the war effort weren't merely sanctioned, they were made. Examples of the hegemony had always practiced assimilation, sometimes forcibly, but under KAC planets were stripped bare if they showed the slightest resistance. The purification of Epsilon. Atom Commander Quiller whispered, his membrane paling at the memory. 3 billion sentients, our own citizens. It was necessary. High Chancellor PC Lur insisted, though his bioluminescent patterns betrayed his discomfort. The colony had been corrupted by human propaganda. They were considering neutrality. Neutrality had become the ultimate crime under CAC's rule, either fully committed to victory or complicit in defeat, he would declare during his empire-wide broadcasts. As resources dwindled and casualties mounted, his solutions became increasingly extreme. The thought harmonizers weren't his worst invention, Vex Thor noted grimly, but they were certainly his most insidious. The devices, mandatory for all citizens of the hegemony, suppressed independent thinking, while amplifying loyalty to the Supreme Overlord. Creativity, once the cornerstone of their civilization, became suspicious. Innovation was permitted only in service to the war effort. Art, music, literature, all redirected toward propaganda, or eliminated entirely. He told me once, Admiral Zolvan said quietly, that the humans had taught him the greatest lesson of his political career: democracy is inefficient, compassion is weakness, and only absolute control ensures survival within the war council itself. Disagreement with Cossack strategies had become increasingly dangerous. Empty seats around the obsidian table testified to the fate of those who had questioned his methods too persistently. Some had been publicly executed, others simply disappeared, their names erased from official records, as if they had never existed. The most terrifying aspect of CAC's rule wasn't the brutality, it was the calculation behind it. Every atrocity served a purpose. Every punishment delivered a message. He didn't seek to be feared, he sought to make fear itself an obsolete concept replaced by absolute unquestioning obedience. 3 years ago, General Brethar recalled, when we successfully bombarded the human colony on Mars, he didn't celebrate our victory. He simply asked why it had taken so long, then doubled the resource quotas for all military production facilities. His last decree, issued mere days ago, had been his most extreme yet: the deployment of automated terraforming engines against Earth itself, not to conquer the planet, but to render it uninhabitable, to literally change its atmosphere to one toxic to human life. Billions would die slowly, painfully, as their own air poison them a necessary evil. KAC had called it a mercy compared to what they deserve. Now his head sat on their war table, his final expression suggesting he might have in his last moments recognized something that had eluded him his entire life. He was not, in fact, untouchable. You think your overlord was cruel to you? The human voice cut through their reflections. You should see what he did to our colonies. Do the human standing before the War Council wasn't particularly imposing, at least not by hegemony standards. Standing barely 6 feet tall, she possessed no natural armor, no visible offensive adaptations, and only the standard number of limbs. For her species, her short auburn hair was slicked back with what might have been sweat, or possibly Kark's fluorescent Blood, a jagged scar, ran from her right temple to her jaw, giving her face an asymmetrical quality that most hegemony aesthetic standards would consider deeply flawed, yet something about her commanded attention. Perhaps it was the casual way she tossed the head of the most powerful being in 7 galaxies onto their table. Perhaps it was how she lounged in the ceremonial throne of the Supreme Overlord, a seat that until today no one else had dared to occupy. Commander Elara Frost. She introduced herself with a mock salute. Though my friends call me L, not that any of you qualify. The name sent a ripple of recognition through the assembly. Even here in the highest echelons of the Hage's military command, that designation carried weight. The ghost of New Armstrong, whispered Admiral Zolvan, his tentacles contracting in fear. The butcher of Titan base, his commander Quilnar, the human who would not die, rumbled General Brathard, his scales darkening to a deep crimson of biological response to extreme threat. Vex Thor studied her more carefully. Now intelligence reports on this particular human had been classified at the highest levels accessible only to Kazak himself. But rumors spread even among the elite. According to those whispers, Elara Frost had once been a simple mining engineer on one of Earth's lunar colonies, not a soldier, not a leader, just a civilian with expertise in deep core extraction techniques. Until the Hegemon's first strike. You were at New Armstrong base, Vex Thor stated, not a question, but an attempt to confirm the fragments of information he'd collected over the years. Front row seat, Frost replied, her smile never reaching her eyes. Your overlord's first demonstration of hegemony power. 2,000 civilian miners and their families, no strategic value whatsoever, just a message. The chamber grew uncomfortably silent. New Armstrong had been Kak's opening move in the official war, a display of force meant to shock humanity into immediate surrender. The mining colony had been specifically chosen because it was isolated, minimally defended, and populated primarily by civilian workers and their dependents. There were supposed to be no survivors, General Brathar noted, still staring at her with obvious disbelief. Yeah, well, I've always been terrible at following expectations. Or fingers drummed against the armrest of Kak's drone, leaving small red smears. Found myself in an emergency pressure suit, half buried under rubble, with 97% of my colleagues and their kids vaporized around me. Excellent motivation. What followed her survival had become almost mythological within both human and hegemony ranks. A lone survivor transforming into humanity's most effective asymmetric warfare specialist. She wasn't a conventional military commander. She was something far more dangerous, an engineer who had redirected her talents from building to destroying, with an intimate understanding of exactly how complex systems failed. Within 2 years of New Armstrong, she had masterminded the destruction of 7 hegemony outposts, 3 capital ships, and 1 particularly devastating strike against a crucial supply depot that had set back the Overlord's war effort by months. You attacked military targets, High Chancellor PC Lore observed carefully, not civilian ones. Our intelligence noted this pattern. Don't mistake that for mercy, Frost replied, her voice hardening. Just efficiency. Why waste resources killing your civilians when dismantling your military is more effective? Besides, her gaze swept the room, making deliberate eye contact with each council member. I wanted you all alive to see this moment, to understand exactly how badly you miscalculated. She patted the severed head almost affectionately. Hey, AC, and I had unfinished business. You lot are just the bonus round. 3 weeks ago, AA continued, twirling a combat knife between her fingers with hypnotic precision. Your Supreme Overlord agreed to peace talks. This revelation caused more surprise among the council members than the severed head had. Several let out involuntary vocalizations of shock. Impossible, declared High Chancellor PEX Lore, his exoskeleton clicking rapidly in agitation. The Supreme Overlord would never negotiate with spare me RM. Off. Your intelligence services intercepted our quantum communications, revealing a potential vulnerability in Earth's defense grid. KAC knew he could finish the war with one decisive strike, but he wanted to savor it to make us beg first. Vex Thor felt a chill pass through his central nervous column. This information was accurate, disturbingly so. The Supreme Overlord had indeed discovered a critical weakness in Earth's defensive systems, one that would allow the Hegemony's planet killer fleet direct access to the human homeworld. But that intelligence had been shared with only 5 individuals in the entire empire. The negotiations were a trap. Allah continued, her voice maintaining that unsettlingly calm tone. Both sides knew it. We sent our delegation anyway, 7 of Earth's best diplomats, including Admiral Chen, hero of the Europa campaign. She paused, studying the reactions around the table. I advised against it, said you couldn't be trusted, but humanity's leadership insisted on pursuing every possible path to peace, even ones that stank of a setup. Her knife stopped spinning suddenly, pointing directly at General Brithkar. Your thermal weapons made quite a spectacle of our shuttle. General, very thorough. No survivors again. The massive alien shifted uncomfortably, scales rippling in patterns that, to those familiar with his species, betrayed genuine unease. Standard elimination protocols, he rumbled defensively. The treaty delegation was under a flag of TR. Elara replied, her first display of genuine emotion flashing across her features. Admiral Chen was my friend, had a 10-year-old daughter back on Earth, loved terrible jokes, and collected ancient comic books. He believed right until the end that reasonable beings could reach reasonable agreements. She stood suddenly, causing several council members to flinch, walking slowly around the table, knife stilling in hand. She continued, speaking, after your little demonstration, KAC sent us a message, said the deaths were regrettable but necessary to ensure we understood our position. Then he outlined his terms: unconditional surrender, followed by the humane relocation of humanity to controlled habitats. Her laughter echoed through the chamber, a sound with absolutely no warmth or humor in it. We've read your procedural manuals on relocation, by the way, very efficient, separating families to prevent organized resistance, sterilization to control population growth, systematic elimination of cultural identity. Really heartwarming stuff. She stopped behind Admiral Zolvan, whose tendrils were now fully contracted against his body in obvious terror. That broadcast was the moment I decided your overlord needed to lose his head, literally. She tapped the flat of her blade against the edge of his seat. Our leadership wanted to try one last diplomatic solution. I offered an alternative approach. They gave me 48 hours to make my point before they authorized the release of our doomsday weapons. Doomsday weapons, squeaked Commander Quill. Nar Allah smiled, that terrible smile again. Oh, you didn't think we'd been sitting idle while you planned our extinction, did you? We've got our own planet killers now, pointed at every major hegemony world. She returned to Kak's throne, sitting down with exaggerated casualness. So here's the situation you've got. She made a show of checking her wrist device. About 26 hours to decide whether this war ends with one head or several billion. Infiltrating the Supreme Overlord's fortress had been considered impossible. Even discussing such an operation was treason of the highest order. You must understand, Grand Admiral Vexthor said carefully. Kak's personal stronghold on Nexus Prime was protected by 27 layers of security, automated defense grids, quantum scanners, gravity wells, neural disruptors, shifted barriers, 10,000 elite guards. Don't forget the genetically engineered predator beasts, added Commander Quillnar, his membrane quivering, bred specifically to hunt humans by scent. AA nodded, looking almost bored. Yeah, those were annoying. Had to stuff my suit with thorax and swamp moss to mask my biochemistry. Smelled like rotten eggs for days. But the null zone, General Breath insisted, his voice rising in disbelief. No technology functions within the inner sanctum. No weapons, no shields. Nothing. That's why I brought this. AA replied, patting her combat knife. Old school carbon steel with a titanium core. Made it myself. I Chancellor PEX lores. Bioluminescent patterns flashed in patterns expressing utter confusion. But the guards were expecting threats from outside, not already inside. AAR interrupted. You really should run better background checks on your maintenance contractors. The council exchanged alarmed glances as the implications sank in. You posed as maintenance personnel. Admiral Zolvan's tendrils writhed in agitation. Impossible. Bioscanners would have identified me as a species not in your database. AA grind. Fun fact, your scanners were programmed to detect humans from Earth. I just had our geneticist tweak my surface markers to register as an unknown but non-threatening species. Your security assumed I was from one of those newly assimilated worlds in the Kina sector. No one questions the cleaning staff. The sheer audacity of her approach had the council stunned into silence for 3 entire days. She explained she had methodically serviced environmental systems throughout the fortress, mapping security patrols, learning access codes, and planting small undetectable disruptors at key junctions. Your overlord had quite the ego. She continued conversationally, insisted on personally approving the atmospheric settings in his private quarters, something about the optimal blend for his superior cognitive function. So I scheduled a routine maintenance appointment. He would never allow a mere maintenance worker into his personal chambers. Vex Thor objected. He made me wait in the antechamber while his guards inspected my equipment. Standard procedure. Alice shrugged. But they didn't think to check the ventilation shaft I'd modified the previous day. Amazing how even the most advanced security systems have the same basic vulnerability. They're designed by people who can't imagine being outsmarted. She leaned forward, her expression suddenly intense. Want to know the truly pathetic part? When I dropped into his sleeping chamber, he didn't even try to fight, just offered me planets, resources, technology, anything to spare his life. Your supreme leader, the mighty CAC, begged like a child. Do Allah's expression darkened as she recounted her final confrontation with Supreme Overlord Krazak. The War Council chamber grew deathly silent, every being present hanging on her words. I didn't go there planning to kill him, she admitted, surprising the assembled alien leaders. The original mission was intelligence gathering, find his personal command codes, access his strategic plans, discover the extent of the terraforming weapon deployment. She ran her finger along the edge of her knife, not breaking icon with Grand Admiral Vex Thor. But then I saw it on his private terminal. He had been watching footage of the new Armstrong massacre on loop for pleasure. A collective discomfort passed through the council, even by hegemony standards. Deriving entertainment from civilian casualties was considered distasteful. 2,000 people, miners, engineers, their children, and your Supreme Overlord had edited the footage to focus on their final moments. Their suffering had added musical accompaniment. Her voice remained steady, but her knuckles whitened around the knife handle. That's when my mission parameters evolved. HAC had awoken to find her standing at the foot of his sleeping platform, studying the grotesque video compilation. According to AA, he hadn't immediately recognized the danger. Accustomed as he was to absolute obedience and security, he asked if I was a scheduled pleasure companion. She said with disgust. When I didn't respond appropriately, he finally noticed something was wrong. Started reaching for his emergency beacon. What followed was not the epic battle one might expect between the most powerful being in the universe and a lone human assassin. There was no prolonged exchange of blows, no dramatic monologues. I disabled his emergency beacon with an EMP patch, small enough to smuggle past security, AA explained. Then I showed him what I'd found on his terminal, asked him if he had any final words to justify what I was seeing. Kak's response, according to Era, had been revealing, no remorse, no attempt to explain strategic necessity. Instead, he had offered her wealth, power, even a position in his inner circle. When those bribes failed, he resorted to threats. He told me humans were a biological mistake, that our existence offended the natural order of the universe. A cold smile played across her features, rich, coming from someone with tentacles growing out of his head. The moment of the actual killing was described with unsettling detachment. CAC had lunged for a concealed weapon. Elara had anticipated this, having studied his quarters thoroughly during her maintenance duties. The knife found its mark with surgical precision. 7 eyes, and he still didn't see it coming, she remarked. The actual beheading had been pragmatic rather than vengeful, and necessary confirmation of kill for her mission parameters, and evidence for this very meeting. Your species can regenerate from substantial injuries, Era noted, glancing at General Brethar, whose species was known for their healing abilities. I wasn't taking chances, besides I needed proof. She leaned back in the throne, studying the head that now sat in the center of the war table, walked right out through the main entrance. Afterward, alarms were blaring, guards running everywhere. But they were all rushing inward to their leader chambers. Nobody expects the assassin to be calmly walking in the opposite direction. Your security protocols need serious updating. Due to War Council chamber remained suspended in tense silence as the enormity of the situation settled upon them. The most powerful military leaders of the hegemony stared at the human who had single-handedly changed the course of galactic history, trying to process what her presence meant for their future. Grand Admiral Vex Thor was the first to recover his composure. With deliberate slowness, he straightened his ceremonial collar and addressed AA directly. You mentioned a time limit, 26 hours remaining before your species deploys planet killers against our homeworlds. What precisely are your terms? Commander Frost Oz's smile was razor sharp. Finally, someone asks the right question. She produced a small data crystal from her pocket, tossing it casually onto the table beside Krex. Head full terms are detailed there. The short verse: immediate cessation of all hostilities. Complete withdrawal from human-controlled space reparations for destroyed colonies. Preposterous, bellowed General Brithcard, his massive fist slamming down on the table. The hegemony does not surrender. We have dominated the stars for 12,000 cycles. We will not be dictated to by a species that was throwing spears at each other mere centuries ago. AA didn't even flinch. Your call, General. How many of your people are you willing to sacrifice for your pride? Because make no mistake, she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper, if you refuse these terms, extinction isn't just on the table, it is the table. Commander Quilnar's membrane had gone completely pale. You would destroy entire civilizations over this conflict. Trillions of beings who had no part in the war. Does seem extreme, doesn't it? AA replied, examining her fingernails with exaggerated nonchalance. Almost as extreme as, say, planning to terraform an inhabited planet to slowly suffocate its population. Biological warfare on a planetary scale. Ring any bells? Chancellor PEX Lore's bioluminescent patterns flashed in a sequence denoting extreme distress. The Supreme Overlord's policies were not unanimously supported within the Council. Many of us advocated for more restrained approaches. How convenient that you've all suddenly developed moral compunctions. Aya's voice dripped with sarcasm. Where was this ethical awakening when your fleets were glassing our colonies? Admiral Zulvan's tendrils twisted nervously. What guarantee do we have that humanity will honor these terms if we accept that this isn't merely the prelude to our own extermination, regardless of compliance? For the first time, Az's expression softened fractionally. Unlike your former leader, we don't view genocide as an acceptable military strategy. Humanity wants to survive, not rule. Accept our terms, and we'll focus on rebuilding what was lost rather than avenging it. Grand Admiral Vex Thor studied the human carefully, then glanced at the severed head of CAC. A decision crystallized in his mind with formal precision. He rose to his full height and addressed the Council. I move to accept the human terms, effective immediately. All in favor. One by one, hands, claws, tendrils, and appendages of various configurations rose in agreement. Even General Brathcare, after a moment of stubborn resistance, grudgingly raised his massive scaled arm. It seems we have consensus, Vex Thor announced, turning to AA. He added, the Galactic Hegemony accepts your terms. Commander Frost, the war is over. Alice stood stretching casually, as if waking from a nap rather than concluding an interstellar conflict. Smart decision. I'll inform Earth's leadership immediately. As she moved toward the exit, she paused, glancing back at the Counts and the grisly trophy still centered on their table. You might want to update your civilization scale, she suggested with a final knowing smile. Turns out we're not so primitive after all.